All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining this month's office hours. Just a reminder, we are recording the session. It's only the speaker's video and voice that's recorded. The chat is not recorded, but all of our sessions are available on the YouTube channel, and I've dropped the link in the chat for anyone who wants to join or anybody who wants to watch the past sessions. It has been a long day already. So we'll start with some intros. My name is Mandy George. This is my third year in the Adobe Analytics Champions program. I've been doing analytics for a little over 5 years, and I am a senior analyst at Staples Canada. And I'll pass it off to Jeff.
Yes, my name is Jeff Bloomer, and I am the manager of digital analytics at Kroger Personal Finance. And so this is actually my fourth year with the Adobe Champions this year. So super excited about that. I'm hoping a couple more of the colleagues are going to be joining us here. But yes, super excited to be involved with this again for another year. So yes, let's jump into it. Got one more person here.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jason Egan. I guess now technically a champion alumni, technically. So, but look forward to jumping in and helping whenever I can, of course, still. But I am an analytics architect with Further, formerly you may have known us as Search Discovery. I've been working with Adobe. I just checked my LinkedIn profile, and it's scary to see that it's almost 20 years now that I've been working with technology. It made me feel like that gif of Matt Damon aging and Robert Ryan, But yeah, I've been pretty deep into the Adobe stack for, I guess, almost 2 decades now. So I'm happy to jump in and help wherever I can.
Awesome. We are supposed to have another speaker, but she is running late. So when she joins, we'll get her to introduce herself. We did get some pre-submitted questions, so I am going to share my screen. Hang on, there we go. All right, so yeah, so we did get some pre-submitted questions. So we'll be going through those. If you have any questions you want us to answer, feel free to drop them in the chat at any point. So the first question that we had is how to extract all the data rules, etc., from Adobe Launch.
It looks like Jen answered that one, but I'll just agree with her statement there that you can use an API. We used to actually have on our website, of course, it's, we're a consultancy, so it's a lead generation tool, of course. I tried to find it. I can't find it anymore, but someone here wrote a script that would, do that for you if you filled out a form and just spit out, like, here are all your rules and your data elements, and it would just spit it all out using the API for you. I know that after this, right after the video is recorded, we could provide some links. If I can find a link to that form, it may not exist anymore since, like I said, we used to be Search Discovery, now we're Further, so I don't really know that form's accessible anymore. But if it is, I'll try and find that and dig it up, and we can add it as a thing to provide a link to possibly. But yeah, I'm not aware of any other way to do it other than an API necessarily like this myself. So.
Yeah, I've never tried to extract any of the rules from Launch, so I don't really have much to add to that one.
Yeah.
All right.
Looks like someone dropped there's a Google Sheet extension. Oh, you know what? Thank you, Bjorn. Yeah, I actually have seen that extension now that you mentioned that. So that is a good extension that was dropped in there that does spit all that stuff out and create a Google Doc, a Google Sheet with a set of tabs, I believe. Yeah, it's been a little while since I've used that actually, but yeah, that is actually a good tool, good recommendation.
Awesome. So the next question is a little bit of a long one. So in our implementation, we tend to have corresponding evars and props. For example, page URL as an evar and a prop, We recently changed the expiration of our page dimension from hit to visit. This way, page dimension would persist when actions were performed on the page, and we can see what is associated with those actions. It was also recommended that we use Adobe Launch to have our props continue firing after their first hit to replicate the expire after visit setting of EVARs. However, my understanding is that props only recommend. Should the props be changed to expire after the visit?
So
So
actually love this question. Probably caught me on a hot mic earlier, maybe a few people. Okay, so props and so otherwise known as traffic variables, um, out of the box are set up by Adobe to expire after the hit. So that's something that you cannot configure. You cannot change the behavior of an out of the box variable. So traffic variables are always going to, unfortunately, you cannot change the behavior of an out of the box variable. So a prop is a prop is a prop is a prop. But thankfully, you do have conversion variables, which are EVARs, and those do expire after the visit. So you have those. Now, the thing is, EVARs can behave like a traffic variable. They did that quite a while back. So you have the option to have and use use EVARs similar to traffic variables. However, if you're looking to just have the behavior of a prop and you do want it to just expire after the hit, go ahead and pass your page variable into that prop, and then double it also in an EVAR. So do it in both. We have done this is something that I've done in the past when you're trying to understand, because traffic variables have a different type of behavior, because you can follow page value, you can follow traffic variables, you can follow them in page flows. That's the nice thing of traffic variables. Okay, and you can also do some of the same things with EVARs now, but that's the beauty of traffic variables. So long answer is sorry, no, you can't do it, but at the same time understand the differences of why you're using either one, and I'll then go ahead and pass it off.
Well, I'll just say sorry, number one, for my short response there, and share a tip that I just discovered is if you use dark mode in Adobe Analytics, you can't read all of that text that's describing that entire situation right there under that
Okay.
Landy screen. I
oh,
literally couldn't see that until you just now said that. So you read this, and I had to stare at my screen for like a minute or two, like why can you see that text and I can't? And for me, it's like black text on dark gray, and I can't even see it. So heads up if you ever use the dark mode in Adobe Analytics, if you can't see the edit description values of things. So
that sounds like a bug.
yeah, so it's something I just discovered. But yeah, I had to
Yeah.
highlight it, to see it. Like I didn't even know that description was there under that header.
Oh gosh.
Hmm.
Yeah. I guess just to add on to what Jeff was saying, there are a lot of times that we do replicate a variable in an EVAR and a prop, but we do it purposefully with the different settings for different purposes. So the prop we use to identify like just the traffic, for example, our search term. We bring that into a prop so we can see how many people actually did a search. And then we bring it into an EVAR or even a merge EVAR. That way we can see the conversion associated with it. But if you have a merge EVAR set up for search, for example, and they don't click onto a product, it doesn't have anything to bind to, it doesn't capture that value. So having a prop that'll always fire so you can get that traffic is still good. So there are benefits to having, EVAR and prop capturing the same data, but set up differently.
Yeah, for that purpose, I actually just used the instance of the EVAR being set up. Sorry, I'm late, everyone. because the instance will give me the value. It doesn't work for like the merchandising EVARs, but certainly for a regular EVAR, the instance is where it gets set, and the just regular, like whatever, is it being carried forward. So that's how I normally distinguish it rather than having duplication. And I wanted to point out one other thing about, using those long attributions like visit on an EVAR. That can get you into some weird data situations. Like if a value fails to send, the previous value will continue to send in the wrong context. Or like say on an action, if you are expecting page to load, person to click on a link, and that link has information relative to the page, if the person clicked before the page actually finished and the page finished loading and sending the data, that information that you're sending on that click on page 2 is actually telling you it's for page 1, which is wrong. So that's another thing you got to be careful about, which is why unless I am actually using a true attribution EVAR, something like an external campaign, or an internal campaign, something that I actually need to be remembered throughout the visit, I always set it to hit. And I'm just very meticulous about making sure that EVAR is populated on every page and every action, every click that it needs to be, so that I never run into that potential attribution issue.
Anyone have anything else to add to that before we move on to the next question? Okay. So the next question is, what is the best way to show link activity once an individual lands on your home page? Ideally, it would show the list of all the links that they clicked on while browsing. Jason, do you want to take this one first?
Yeah, I'll go in first and just say, I put best in there in air quotes for a reason. I mean, it's just my opinion, right? I think there are a lot of different ways to do this, but and you'll see Jen in her next thing is kind of very much on the opposite end of the thing. So I don't typically use activity map, and I have my reasons for not wanting to use activity map. I can go into that maybe, but in general, typically when I want to do link tracking, it's going to be one of these 3 options that I kind of mentioned here below. It's in the second 3 that you see there. Number 1, either custom HTML parameters being assigned to to all of the links that you want to track in question. So you might have in an anchor tag, something like data-link equals this, data-region equals this, data-link type equals this. And in data collection, you would have a rule that on click of a link, it would grab all of those things and set them in an EVAR, probably, maybe concatenating them so you save space and not have to set 3 EVARs, for example. And page name that it happened on, so that you can report on the page name in which it happened. The challenge there is that your developers or someone that manages the content on your site has to actually apply all of those custom HTML parameters to all of the links. That's not a small undertaking necessarily, and it's just another thing for people to maybe mess up, possibly, right? That can always happen. The same thing can be said for option 2, which is a data layer event that would trigger on a link. This is just a JavaScript event that would be dispatched by your site, by the developers, and you would fire a server call off. But similarly, the developers are going to have to provide the link, the region, the page name, and all of the data that you would want as a part of that data layer event. So when I say best, it's best because you as the analyst don't have to do these things, right? It's all on the developers to implement, which is great, but it can be challenging over time. Number 3 can be DOM scraping, which is just using what you have on the page. So same concept, you track whenever the click of a link happens, you ideally set it on the next page and not when it happens, because Adobe charges you by server calls. So the more links you fire, the more expensive it gets. So if they move from page A to page B on your site, grab the click of page A when they land on page B, basically, which is what Activity Map essentially does also. But beyond that, obviously, Activity Map is an option, and Activity Map, I would say, is close to DOM scraping in that it takes what it can get from the page essentially and what it sets. That's not to say that you can't customize Activity Map to look at custom parameters and different HTML parameters on the page, and still use that tool to grab that information. I will say the only caveat that I give with Activity Map really is if you use it on the overlay specifically on a page that changes fairly frequently, it can be a little confusing to interpret, because if a page changes on Wednesday and you run an Activity Map overlay that's Monday through Friday, it's going to have links for it that aren't visually on the page at that moment, and it does have a way of kind of reporting that to you, but it can be a little misleading. I always look at Activity Map as a great place to go to begin to ask questions, but maybe not provide the final analysis on your questions as to link usage. I'll turn it over to you, Jen, if you want to go on discussing your area.
Sure. I mean, I have nothing wrong with doing on clicks on stuff. It's just it is server calls. I got to keep my implementation lean because we don't have the extra server calls to track everything, but we want to track everything, which is why Activity Map for us is so good. Now, I will agree with you. The Activity Map overlay tool, hate it. Absolutely haven't used it in years. I actually use the raw data right in Report Builder and the workspaces. Like I said, I do not like the overlay. I work for a newspaper. Our site changes 20 times a day or more. So I agree with you. The disappearing links doesn't make for a very usable report. But Activity Map, out of the box, obviously has some challenges. The region, it picks up the closest ID, which for anyone who's worked with their developers knows that the ID names tend to be unreadable, unparsable, ununderstandable by anybody except for the developers. But you can control that. You can actually set up your own custom regions, and with a simple line of code in your Activity Map extended code, you just put s.activitymap region ID attribute, and you tell it what data attribute you actually want to look for. So I've worked exclusively with our developers, setting up a region for every area of our site: the header, the main menu, the main body content, the right rail, the left rail, the footer, what have you. I even work with them to make sort of like dynamic names based on blocks on the page. Again, being a newspaper, we have a block for news, a block for sports, a block for politics. And those blocks can be renamed. So I said, make it dynamic, make it reflect what the content is, and then we never have to go in and manually set it all the time. So that's one way to get your regions up to much better than what Activity Map's going to pick out by default. And then, of course, if you need to override links or exclude links, you can do that through the s_object ID. So you can actually set the link to a specific value, or you can exclude entire individual links or an entire region of links. Like maybe there's PII information that when you click on it, it's tracking somebody's name or it's tracking somebody's email because that's what the link is showing. You can actually stop that from happening. So there's a lot of little tricks you can do with Activity Map, but then it tracks it, but it doesn't inflate your server calls. So that's what I like about it. It doesn't work for everyone. I get it. Obviously works, do with what works for you, not what works for me, not what works for Jason. You always have to do checks and balances against everything to find the best solution for your organization. Anyone else? Jeff, do you have anything to add? Nope. You're not touching it with a 10-foot pole. Got it.
No, it's not that. It's like I feel like it's really just been covered really well.
Yeah. I'm just messing with you.
What else is new?
Yeah, I know.
All right. So we have one other question that was pre-submitted. Jen, you might not have seen this one. It came in just recently before the session.
Yeah, I
So it
really
says,
didn't
I need
see
help.
it because, like I said earlier, all I could see was just validating my affirmative cookie consent metric and nothing
Yeah.
else. So I'm going
Yeah.
to actually read
The
it now.
interesting point. Ying mentioned in the chat that not being able to see the description is a feature, not a bug, apparently.
Yes, and you know,
So
it just teaches you to test in
yeah.
both dark mode and light mode if you are going to be creating a report for somebody.
Not being able to see the
Apparently.
description in dark mode when you use a particular script type. Is that a correct statement?
I don't know.
I don't know.
That's weird.
'Cause I
I've
know that-
never tried to use dark mode.
No,
So
well, no, because I use dark mode because I know now this is an interesting thing. It's actually a point that we might want to talk about because I know that if you use the first couple types of text in here, like the very far left black text, it will change to white. For instance, so if you use that color palette, that black will change to white
this one?
when you go to dark mode. However, if you use black, the third one in, it will not.
I think ours is. I don't think we bothered with colors to be.
We have.
Yeah, this is.
You and I played around with that once or twice, Jen.
No, I mean, Mandy when she put the Mandy.
Oh, you didn't. Okay.
No, we
Yes.
didn't- we didn't
Yeah,
do
no,
that.
I just left the.
Yeah. But I seem to remember that Jen and I played around with colors in dark mode and light mode. This is actually a thing that when you are working in Adobe Analytics, I know it created a little bit of a tangent here, but when you are working within Adobe Analytics, whether it's light mode, dark mode, and all that stuff, and Jason, you did bring up a good point. If you're trying to describe something or something for your users and somebody is using light mode or dark mode in this, you want to make sure that the color palette that you're using will, so I would test things going back and forth between light mode and dark mode so that something does not disappear when it's, if somebody decides that they want to look at your report in dark mode or light mode, for instance. So it's a fair point. It sounds like a nitpick, but it's actually could be something important if you're trying to make sure to point something out to one of your data consumers, and it could be an important thing that you want to call out.
Yeah. It also might just be a recent development. I'm seeing a couple of people in chat. Maria never had problems with dark mode. Dave, I remember working with that, the transparent menus. I do remember that conversation with you on that one.
You do remember that, don't you, Jen?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. And also, the when
Right.
you are changing between dark and light and dark, some stuff doesn't change until you refresh the page.
Yeah.
But it also, I think they did a minor release this week. It's entirely possible they broke something in dark mode. I don't know if anyone's in dark mode right now that can see their own descriptions or not. Fun interactivity. Go check your dark mode.
Yes. And it will also sometimes require you to actually save your workspace again when you switch from light mode to dark mode, and vice versa.
Oh, yep. We got some people going to look. They can tell us the.
I love it. I love it. See. Just
no, that's
this is what it's all about, folks.
Never a dull moment.
No. This is we're generating.
Yeah,
always love playing.
We all get paid for doing Adobe QA.
Yeah. Ying is like your 5 cents is in the mailman. No.
Hey, in Canadian money, that's almost 10 cents. Come on.
Oh, okay. Well,
Yeah.
By the time it gets here, it'll all be taxed, so it's a wash anyway.
Yeah, that's true.
Anyway, always fun playing. Is it a bug or is it a feature?
Right.
All right. So the question that was submitted, I need help validating my affirmative cookie consent metric. I inherited an implementation that wasn't accurately calculating this, and stakeholders were led to believe consent rate was in the 80 to 90% range because they were looking at opt in instances as if it was an indicator of affirmative consent. Now I've updated the calculation. It's abysmally low, which I expected, but didn't suppose it to be this low. So I need help validating what I created and any suggestions on preparing for the sky is falling conversations I can expect to have once stakeholders see how bad this really is.
So I have an initial question, I guess, on this that maybe it's not stated here, and I see it's asked by Jessica, who is I can see here. So my first question is, are you dealing with an opt-in or an opt-out scenario here? In other words, do you automatically collect data and they have to opt out, or right, that's the kind of opt-out situation, or do you collect it unless people tell you no, don't collect? And whether you're in the United States and or not dealing with GDPR, maybe that might make a difference. The only reason I ask is because both options via OneTrust, yeah, that's typical. So in other words, you're probably using an IP address to know if someone's coming from California, so you make it opt out there and or opt in. No, opt in, yeah, opt in there and opt out everywhere else, for just as an example. But so in that case, I'm not really sure. And this kind of goes to, I think it was just above you, Mark Wolf kind of addressed this kind of similar issue. If in reality, if you are dealing in it with I always have to think it through in my mind, the opt in, opt out, opt in scenario where if it's truly opt in, you shouldn't be collecting anything on them. So you don't know, right? You won't know that someone didn't opt in because you were never tracking them to begin with, if that makes sense, right? So in that kind of scenario, I don't really know how you know for sure the opt-in rate, right? If you don't know the full, denominator of such a calculation to begin with, in a way, right? I believe OneTrust provides some guidance on what those rates are, but I'm not really sure. A calculation like this that says, allow all event from the preference, whether someone allows consent from the preference center of OneTrust or the banner itself that pops up, divided by total page views, you really don't have any kind of data on the people not opting in to be able to unless you're tracking people before they say they should be tracked, which you shouldn't be doing, right? So yeah, I'm not really sure. I don't know, Jeff, Jen, if you have any thoughts on well as that. It's just I don't really know how you can effectively capture an opt-in rate unless you're tracking people tell you not to track them.
Yeah, well, my first thought is it opting out of cookies or is it opting out of tracking? Because those are two different things. You can still have tracking without cookies.
True.
So if you're only opting out of cookies and following that person, it means your user, your unique visitors is going to be inflated because every time that person comes back to the site, they're going to be treated as a new user because they have no cookies. And if that is what your consent is about, cookies, you should still be able to track them without setting the cookies. And then you should be able to track the opt-in versus the opt-out, just not against, particularly users. So it could be a rate based on every time that, the switch actually says, hey, do you want to opt in or opt out or not? But like that's kind of where my thoughts are. Because
I guess my only thought there is most of the laws about these things are really more about data collection and storage as opposed to really just cookies. So if someone says or doesn't give you, the rights to do something, you shouldn't be tracking them.
Well, I thought most
cookies
of
are kind of a non-issue.
Yeah.
Technically.
Well, I thought most of it was about not being able to follow said user, being able to collect basic information about what content is being viewed without tracking it to a user. You're not tracking that user. You're basically just tracking your basic information.
Yeah, and I guess that's up to kind of legal interpretation. I've just seen clients do it both, different ways, and most err on the side of caution, I think, and just, OneTrust typically, like we're talking about OneTrust here, and pretty much every OneTrust implementation that I've ever seen within launch is saying, has a rule that just says you don't track them. It doesn't just stop the cookie from being set. It will outright stop the server call from going out, and they're just not going to be tracked at all. Right. So
Yeah, like Damon was saying, like, because, IP is considered, PII in question if ECID. Well, you can take people out of the ECID. You cannot set an ECID. You can get rid of your backup SVID simply by setting it to session as opposed to, long term. And you can turn off your IP tracking, which means that don't know anything about that user. You could even create custom tracking that says, all right, if the user is logged in, don't track anything about the user ID because they've opted out of, cookies or whatever. But again, it really comes down to what your policy is actually saying. Are you opting out of just tracking said user, or are you opting out of like literally everything? If you're opting out of everything, I don't know how you could possibly get an opt-in rate because you're only tracking the people who opt in. So it's 100% based on the fact that you don't know what you don't know.
yeah. Yeah, and to Ying's point about AEM real use monitoring, I'm not familiar with that, frankly, but if it tracks people in any way whatsoever, then that should also be subject to privacy laws, and you shouldn't be doing it. I mean, it may just be asset data from AEM in terms of like, consumption, I guess, maybe, and like server log data, maybe kind of thing. But if it's tracking people in any way, then it's also subject to these things. So
Yeah, depending on when you sort of set up your tracking and how far back your data goes. One of the previous companies I was with, when we wanted to try and figure out our opt-out rate, we did sort of a pre-post analysis. So we looked at the time period before the tracking was implemented, and then the time period after, or it's not the tracking, sorry, when the opt-out. So we looked at before the opt-out was implemented, and we looked at after the opt-out was implemented. And based on the number of interactions that we got with it and overall changes in traffic, we were able to get a rough estimate of how many people were actually opting out. It's not going to be a perfect number. Yeah, not going to be perfect, but
and unfortunately, that only really works on the switch over, not long term. And if you're very seasonal, then some of that drop could be seasonality. It's so hard to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, so sorry, I guess, Jessica, I don't really have a great answer for you there. I guess to answer, how you calculate it, because I'm not really sure you have the denominator to, total page views. I mean, that number there tells me that it's page views by people that have already granted you consent because you're tracking them with the page view, right?
Yeah.
That would be my question there. So I don't really know that it is possible.
Now, some people did say that OneTrust will track those opt-in, opt-out rates. If you really needed it in your Adobe data, you might be able to, get an export of information from OneTrust and import it into your Adobe data just so you can simply get an opt-in, opt-out rate based on the actual tool, which is performing the opt-in, opt-out. It's a thought.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Any other thoughts on this one? Okay. So that was it for the pre-submitted, but I did see some questions that came into chat. And so I will find the first one. Does prop count as a server call? So that was the first question that came in. So props on their own don't equal a server call, but they're a part of what can be sent in a server call.
Yeah, any page view or link click is a server call basically, and link clicks can be anything like a link click, of course, or a video play, any video metrics, anything that just sends data. I mean, you can send one server call with 20 props in it, and that's still just one server call. Doesn't matter how many props or evars or events are in it; it's just one server call. So,
Yeah.
like we were talking about earlier with Jen, like even when I said track with custom parameters on HTML, the link tracking, you still ideally want to track it on the subsequent page like activity map, because if you track every link, you're effectively doubling your server calls if you do it on an actual link click event, which I always like to tell everybody the story of. I worked for a company, it was a retail commerce company, and this was, God, how long ago? 11, I don't know, 13, 12, 13 years ago. And someone had the idea of like, hey, we should track the rotation of the homepage banner, right? And it's an auto rotating banner. And we found out the next day that people really like to leave our homepage up and then like go out to lunch, and in the 20 years that I mentioned earlier, that's the only time I've ever had Adobe call us and be like, something's wrong with your server calls. Like they shot through the roof, and we're like, oh no. So we then changed it to be like, we would only fire one cycle through and then stop, right, instead of just constantly shooting off. So yeah, you got to watch out for that. But
Yeah. All right. The next question that came into the chat was, how do you import offline data into Adobe Analytics? How do you map existing data and analyze it?
I'll let somebody else speak to that in a minute, if they want to, because I was going to say data sources, but it looks like some of the things in data sources, when I started to look them up, have been mothballed maybe a couple of years ago. So I don't know if I'm right or not anymore. So I'll let someone else say that.
Yeah, I've used data sources before to bring some of the data into Adobe. Mapping it with our existing data is always a bit tricky. And actually, it was an interesting situation that happened because we had a VRS set up that filtered out any traffic from outside the country. And we were importing some transactional data. But when it was set up, the variable that captures region was not set up with it. So our VRS was filtering out everything that we brought in, and it was looking like there was no data because it doesn't automatically map with what you have in there. If you have information that you're bringing in, you need to make sure that you bring in all the right conditions to be able to actually use that data as well.
Yeah, I was going to say typically the way that I would have done this in the past, but I was kind of looking at the documentation, is I would say there's something called transaction ID that you can add to a server call, and then if your offline data has that transaction ID as well, you then upload it and it would tie back to that transaction ID. I think that has a window of like 90 days maybe or something like that where that can work. But then I saw something about full processing data sources being mothballed in 2022. So when I looked at the documentation, so I'm not sure it's an option any longer. That's why I was going to just kind of throw it out there. The only other thing that I would say is there is something called the data insertion API, and this is a little more complex, but if you have customer data and you can inject somehow the visitor ID from an offline data source and actually fire off an API that essentially creates a server call, you can use the data insertion API to mimic something happening. I mean, it wasn't a web page view or a call like that, but it is a server call that would go to Adobe Analytics, and you can track it that way. It wouldn't, and that has worked. I've done that in the past, so that's another option too as well. Obviously, a little more technically complicated, of course. But.
Yeah, I think the data insertion API would be like its own kind of like freestanding, so to speak, server call. Where I think data sources was actually mapping data into existing calls. It's still probably, I don't know if it costs any server call money or not. Mandy, didn't you look into data sources not that long ago?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was when I was at my previous job. We were trying to figure stuff out with that, and I'm trying to remember. I don't believe it used up your server call budget. I would need to go back and double check, but I'm
I'm
like
pretty sure every row
80,
uploaded.
80%.
I
Does it?
think I think every row uploaded is a server call. I think.
Hmm.
I know in stuff like classifications, if you upload something that doesn't already have a value, that counts as a server call.
I didn't know.
Um,
Interesting.
yeah, if you're using the classification importer and
Huh.
you're, putting in values that aren't already captured, that'll count as a new server call each
Weird.
row.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I don't recall the data sources. I thought it didn't, but I could be wrong on that.
I'll
Um,
also add that if offline data is a big concern of yours, that's when maybe you start thinking about customer journey analytics, which is the next kind of evolution of the product, I guess you could say. It has web data just in the same way that you have web data, not exactly the same way, but it does. But you can bring offline data sets in there, and they can be stitched together with online data for visitor identification. So very powerful if you can do it. Obviously, it's a different SKU and it's going to be more expensive, but that's the benefit of the tool.
yeah. I just did a quick Google and found the data sources FAQ on Experience League. And the first one is, what is the cost to use data sources? And it says data sources do not incur any charges, nor do they count towards server call usage. Full processing data sources counted towards server calls before its retirement.
Okay, that's probably the one that
So
I was.
that might be
Yeah,
what you were remembering.
yeah.
Um, yeah, I dropped the link to that FAQ in the chat. So whoever asked about the data sources, if you want to look at that, you
Yeah,
can.
and that's why I was wondering, right? Like full processing, is that the one that uses the transaction ID? Am I wrong?
I think so, but I think that's the one that's no longer
Yeah, exactly. So
around.
what I'm saying is, never mind what I said earlier. I'm not really sure. Like, so does that mean that data sources is now effectively just an upload of flat data that doesn't really tie to online activity anymore? Then, if full processing was removed or retired, it kind of seems that way, right?
Mm.
Sorry, I haven't used it in quite a while. So
If a row in a data source file includes a transaction ID that does not contain a match, the row is treated similarly to a summary data source.
yeah, so I guess it still does work.
So possibly.
Yeah, fair enough. The thing to note
Yeah.
about that, though, is like the transaction ID. If you upload something and you upload it against the transaction ID, then that event will happen when the transaction ID was set, I believe, actually. So it's a little weird in terms of its timing and the reporting, right? So.
All right. I am scrolling through the chat trying to see if there were any other questions that were submitted. There's been some really great conversation in the chat today, so there's a lot to scroll through.
I feel like the data source one was the last one that I saw, I think.
Yeah, I think the rest is just chat about the topics that we were talking about. So does anybody else have questions that they want to ask? Or if anybody did put in a question that we missed scrolling through, feel free to repost it. Uh, oh, there was one other question. Can Adobe Analytics operate without cookies? Jen, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, because I think this is touching again on some of that like cookie opt out. If you're opting out of cookies, I mean, it's not totally cookieless. You can, opt out of the ECID so it won't set the ECID stuff. You can set your S cookies to session so they clear after every session. But I think what Mark was actually going for was they wanted to do a completely cookieless operation. And one of the things that we had done a couple of years ago is we did a custom solution for our AMP pages, wherein we used a server side tracking to send the data to the Adobe servers. So from our server to Adobe. So, because again, for those unfamiliar with AMP, it's horrible. You can't run normal JavaScript on it. It's really limited in what you can do, and we wanted to tie in all the rich analytics that we were collecting on our main web page through our AMP pages. And so we had come up with this solution because neither of the AMP solutions that Adobe provided were actually working for us. So we basically had a backend system that took the data, did lookups from our database, formulated the data, sent it off to the server. But of course, you lose visibility in that way for testing. So we actually had a ping back where the developer would actually send everything that was sent to Adobe back just to a ping back that we could actually read and process. Of course, it doesn't work with any of the tools like Omnibug or the Adobe debugger, but we could see literally everything that was sent, in the, if anyone's used to testing using your network panel, C1, C2, V3, what all of that designations, that's what we actually used to validate that the data was being sent correctly. And I mean, in theory, technically, you could also use the old no script portion where you basically build out the entire string of data and still send it from the client side, not sending cookies, because but again, that's all custom implementation, and it's kind of tricky, but it can be done.
Yeah, we've done that latter before. Yeah. Yep.
Like, so you could still use script. Like when I say the no script solution, I mean the way you used to build out the entire string, but still send it via script, still build it with script. You're building the string yourself rather than letting Adobe do all its stuff.
Cool. We did get one more question in the chat. What's the best course of action when migrating from a third-party to first-party implementation of the AEP Web SDK that's used to send data to AA through the Edge network? Is it worth to spend the time on this given that Safari has its own data privacy mechanism to limit cookie lifespans?
So I guess my comment there would be, yeah, especially with Safari, right? What is it, at 7 days? They're probably going to limit you to right now, I think, for the most part. And when you say first party, really, I guess you're probably talking about using like a CNAME typically, where you're going to have like telemetry.yoursite.com as opposed to Adobe Edge DC.net or whatever it is. And, in reality, Safari can detect CNAME cloaking and things like that now too. So technically speaking, they're still going to know, even if you're using telemetry.yoursite.com, they're going to know still that it's really Adobe in the background. So, the value of using a CNAME mapping in such a way, I guess, is debatable really nowadays. That would be, I guess, my comment there. I don't know that it's also, admittedly, I don't know that it's a very big lift to probably just change, your data collection domain anyway. In such a way, it's not a very difficult thing to do. I don't know if it's going to provide any real benefit necessarily, but I guess that's my comment but a little wishy-washy comment to say I don't really know that it matters, I guess. So
Yeah, I'm not sure. We haven't gone to Web SDK yet, but I thought part of the Web SDK would be that it used server-side cookies, which are not subject to the same client-side cookie limitation.
it's still client-side. It's going to track you with the same with the cookie. It's just a different JavaScript library. Yeah.
All right. There's also some comments in the chat coming in about that.
One tip I'll give you, though, there's a weird checkbox in the Web SDK extension in launch that says allow third-party cookies to be set. I don't know why you would have such a checkbox to not allow them to be set, because I've seen it happen where we implemented and didn't check that box, and every page view was a new session because that box wasn't checked. I don't know why there would be a box to check or uncheck that, but just heads up to watch out for that thing. So, you don't need to check it if you do the first party cookie option, and using a CNAME, but if you don't, just make sure that checkbox is checked. So.
I've been on first party since before we switched to launch, so yeah. I didn't even realize that checkbox exists.
Yeah, well, it's only in Web SDK. It doesn't exist in.
Oh, okay.
Just Web SDK.
Very weird. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, but like I said, only if you're using the Adobe data collection domain. So.
Cool. Last call for any questions. If anyone has any other questions before we wrap up. All right. I'm just going to plug once more. I mentioned at the start of the session, but if anybody is interested, Emma Lockwood at Adobe is looking for feedback on Experience League. So if you are interested in doing a feedback session, especially if you've been using Experience for less than 5 years, you can scan the QR code and set up some time to give your feedback. I personally always like doing the feedback sessions because you actually get to influence the tool and the platform that you use every day.
Yeah. And Emma's great. So I second going and talking with her.
All right. So if there's no more questions, then that is all that we have for today. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and we will hopefully see you next month.
All righty.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye.